Good morning and welcome to this rather early morning session on a new architecture for cyber cooperation. We are going to be discussing this rather important issue with an extremely talented panel. To my left, I have Brad Smith, somewhat of a digital evangelist who's been calling for international cooperation, new modes of engagement, from the Paris call to their peace initiative, to their earlier the Digital Geneva Convention. Microsoft has been at the forefront of looking for solutions that can ensure that all of us trust the digital space. To his left is Alison Martin, who's the Chief Risk Officer at Zurich, and she has had extensive management experience both in the financial and commercial sectors within the larger insurance space. To her left is Catherine de Bolle, who's at the Europol, and she is someone who is uniquely positioned to actually comment on how the private sector, governments, and the civil society work together to create solutions for a specific region. Then we have Gottfried Leibbrandt, who's with the SWIFT, the institution that's responsible for how you and I get our money from various parts of the world, and also how sometimes we don't get our money. And he's going to provide a unique perspective on how do we ensure that SWIFT is trusted, but so are other financial institutions in the digital space. And finally, we have Tzipi Livni, who's a politician from Israel, a former Foreign Affairs and Justice Minister. She's been passionately engaged on trying to find international regimes that will keep the cyberspace safe, but also protect countries like hers, which are open, democratic, and where you're beginning to see the digital space become a political agent and a political actor. So how do you ensure societies trust the digital space? And Livni, I'm going to come to you from that perspective. But before we begin the conversation, let me hand over the stage first to Troels Otting, who's the host and the head of the Cybersecurity Center at the Forum. And in many ways, he's going to frame the debate for us, and I'm going to follow your lead, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panel for taking time to address the audience, and thank you very much for those of you who've had the ability to come up so early in the morning and also attend this very important event. I think it's fair to say that we have never seen a pace of change so fast ever before, but I can promise you we will never see such a slow pace in the future. So things are changing extremely fast. We are not only we are not only in the formation of a fourth industrial revolution change, but we are also transforming the whole society. We are connecting anything from the physical world that can be connected to the internet, and we are delivering a digital trace of what we do that can be kept and stored all over. We are doing incredible things with the internet, and we have to be aware of that we need to not sell fear, but protect hope, to make sure that the good side of the internet is always in focus. But in order to do that, you also have to look at the negative sides, unfortunately. And we have never seen so much crime at the internet as we have right now. It's estimated that we lose $7 billion every year to criminal organizations. We also see a lack of trust because there is nation-state activities. We also see a lack of trust for individuals that we give away our information. Who owns these information? Where do they end up? And we have a truly global environment, which for the majority of the world is uncharted territory, because they are used to deal with security issues inside nation-state borders. But this is not possible. So we are entering uncharted waters now. And for that, we lack a complete new architecture to deal with that. We don't have that. We simply don't have the instruments globally to do this. So while the change is going like this, the trust is basically going in the other directions. So we need to look into how we can do this better. In a previous panel, I had a professor who told me that she was in the first cyber conference 21 years ago. And the conclusions of that session was we should cooperate more, we should share more information, we should do more awareness. And here we are 21 years later, and I hope we are not continuing to say that we should share more and we should learn more, but we should now action. So I think that in that we need to have a much, much stronger cooperation between private and public sector, and we need to have a coalition of the willing who actually wants to make a difference. So I hope that this panel will bring us answers also to some of these questions that we have, and maybe also a way ahead. So I leave it now to you to enlighten us. I'm looking very, very much forward to it, and I hope that we will have a very engaged and active also commitment from the audience to raise questions to these ladies and gentlemen who are truly experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Troels. I think that's a fair opener for us to respond to. And in some ways, just to problematize what Troels just said, if that was not problematic enough, I think all of us are trying to respond to the digital trilemma. How do you grow the digital economy? How do you ensure personal rights and safety are maintained? And how do you ensure national security is not a victim of either of the two? So the digital trilemma is what we are trying to respond to. And I think Brad Smith is a good person to try and offer us an insight on what are we really dealing with? Where have we reached? What is at stake? And are there paths that we must consider now?
Well, thank you. I'm happy to just sort of frame this briefly because we have a great group of people here who can talk about all its various pieces. But if we're trying to describe in a sentence what we're hoping to accomplish, I think all of us, it's really about keeping the world safe. The world depends on digital infrastructure. People depend on their digital devices. And what we've all found is that these digital devices are under attack every single day. And fundamentally, we've seen two trends over the last 5 years that have continued to intensify. One is more prolific and more sophisticated attacks by organized criminal enterprises, sometimes or even oftentimes operating from jurisdictions that are more difficult to reach through the rule of law, but using the internet to seek out victims literally everywhere. And the second thing we've seen is an increase in nation-state attacks. On certain days, acting on a global basis. The 12th of May in 2017 was the WannaCry attack launched by North Korea. It impacted over 150 nations in a single day. What are we trying to do about it? Well, I think what we're trying to do is really take a multifaceted approach. This is the kind of problem that for which there is no single silver bullet. I think it starts with tech companies. Those of us who create this technology have the first responsibility to really keep people safe. You see across the tech sector, individual companies constantly strengthening their security defenses, constantly offering more security services to customers. But second, the industry's found that we really need to act together and not just separately. 2018 was an important year, both because Siemens really sponsored and helped launch what's called the Charter of Trust. At Microsoft, we worked with others to launch what's called the Tech Accord or Tech Sector Accord. We need governments to do more as well. That's one of the things that we've been urging. There have been important governmental efforts over the course of this decade. One of the notable things has one of the more obscure brand names, but it's called the Talon Manual 2.0, but it really advances international norms for governments. We've called, as we've said, for a Digital Geneva Convention. In some ways, I think one of the more interesting days in 2018 was the 12th of November in Paris. That's when the French government announced what's called the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. It advances a number of these principles. We can certainly talk about them if they're interested, if people are interested. But what I think is most notable about the Paris Call is that it represents not just multilateral diplomacy by governments, but really a multi-stakeholder approach. Just 2 days ago, it was announced that there are now more than 500 signatories to the Paris Call. There are 60 governments, and there are over 300 companies. There are over 150 different NGOs and civil society organizations. And I think part of what we're going to need to solve this, or at least address this problem more satisfactorily than we are today, are more multi-stakeholder initiatives like that.
Brad, I'm going to come back to you with on 2 points. One is trust in tech also implies trust in technology companies. And is that a factor today? Are citizens or users beginning to doubt the integrity of the companies themselves? And how do you respond to that as Microsoft, who might be a collateral of this mood? And second, of course, is trying to create global conventions, but yet hanging on to ideologies of the past. For example, the Paris Call has not been signed by certain countries because it continues to peddle the Budapest Convention. Is it time to be more pragmatic and use the clauses where there is agreement and create pools of consensus rather than this ocean of agreement?
Well, I would say, first of all, you ask two great questions. And the first point you make, I think, is an important one. People cannot trust technology unless they have confidence in the companies that are creating the technology. And I think it's a given that as we come together in Davos in 2019, there's more public skepticism, even public concern about technology and the technology sector than there was a year ago today. The Cambridge Analytica episode really served as a flashpoint. And I think it stood not just for the incident in and of itself, but really a watershed moment that seemed to bring together a lot of sort of latent but rising public concerns. And so I think it raises a set of issues that technology companies and the sector as a whole are going to need to address. I think it frankly starts by acknowledging the problems and the skepticism. It then needs to go to companies identifying and talking about the principles on which they're acting, but ultimately it's all a matter of doing something. I think the public has developed a keen ability to differentiate between words and deeds, and you're not going to sustain trust unless there's consistent action and the kind of transparency that lets people assess that. Now then, let's go to your second question, and latent in it is the universality of the Paris Call. One of the interesting things about the Paris Call is it really seeks, in my view, to build a coalition of the world's democratic nations. And it has today all 28 EU member states. It has 27 of the 29 NATO members. It has Canada, Colombia, it has South Korea and Japan just this week, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. There's two big countries that I hope in 2019 will sign the Paris Call. One is India. It's important for the world's largest democracy to stand up to defend democracy with the other great democratic countries of the world. And there's, at least at this point, as I understand it, one concern the Indian government has, which is the Paris Call refers to the Budapest Convention, and India is not a signatory to the Budapest Convention. And my answer would be, it's not a treaty. It's not a contract. It's a call. It's a declaration. We went through this discussion with every government around the world, the British. Well, we didn't draft these 4 words. They found a way to get comfortable. The world needs India to stand up with the other great democracies. And then the other missing nation is my nation, the United States government. And that, of course, in many ways reflects a reluctance at the moment by the current administration to embrace multilateralism. And my answer is, the world, just as it needs India, needs the United States to stand up and defend democracy as well. And democracy can only be defended effectively when the world's democracies act in a united way. Because some of the most focused attacks on technology, using technology, are in fact attacks on democracy itself. Disinformation campaigns, hacking of candidates, and the ultimate concern we all should have, those of us who live in democratic nations, which is the vulnerability of voting systems. If the world's democracies don't come together, we risk being picked apart in ways that fundamentally threaten the values that we all share.
So that's an easy task, getting the US and India to do your bidding. I think that would be easy. Let's go to Gottfried now. He spoke about trust in tech. Let's talk about trust in institutions. SWIFT is both a platform for exchange, but it's also become a political tool. So my 2 questions to you. One, how does SWIFT respond to the whole question of creating a system with integrity when you have cyber fraud, cybercrime, banking theft, digital theft? And 2, how do you insulate yourself from being a geopolitical agent for some actor?
Yeah, so the short answer is you work the problem, and we do that together with the banking community. It's always good that we connect 10,000 banks around the world, and we exchange the information between them that's needed to make global payments work. Banks compete with each other, but it is also a global community. They can only do that by cooperating with each other. So we work with them, and I can give two examples. One is on the front of cyber, where we had the fraud at Bangladesh Bank now 3 years ago, exactly 3 years ago actually, which was quite unprecedented, where we, with hindsight, saw a nation state enter the local environment of a central bank and enter fraudulent payments into and compromise that environment and enter fraudulent payment into the payment system. We got together with our community, designed a program to really work the problem, information exchange, and I think that's a really good example of how globally you can make information exchange in cyber work. Banks exchange with us what they see in terms of compromises, what are the IOCs, indications of compromise, modus operandi, etc. We, based on that, share that information back with them. We share it with the antivirus company, with the security specialists, etc. That part is really working. We designed a set of controls that all the banks in their environment have to comply with, and that's a whole program to beef up security at the edge. And the other thing is transaction monitoring, making sure that when you see payments that are out of the ordinary, it doesn't get paid out, but it gets returned to the bank that has been frauded. I have to say that program has been successful to the extent that we have not seen a repeat of the type of attack that we saw in Bangladesh. The bad guys keep trying, but not with the success that they had in the initial attacks. And that's really been an effort by the global banking community. So that's, I think, one example of where you can make it work. At the end of the day, abolishing technology is not the answer. We're not going to go back to live in caves or not be connected. Indeed, when you had to go to the bank to pick up the money physically, we didn't have cyber fraud. Now everything is connected, and with that comes that challenge. You work the problem and make it work. Geopolitics, I think, is the same answer. At the end of the day, you get together with the community, you make it work. Obviously, sanctions are a difficult one. They are by nature political. It works if they're multilateral in the context of the United Nations, and we've always said if they're multilateral, then of course we will comply with them. It was made difficult last year in November around the Iranian sanctions, where Europe and the US had diametrically opposing views on what to be done. And we were forced to make a choice between the two at the end of the day. Again, we consulted with our community, and clearly we all agreed that we had to do what we do, which is maintaining the integrity of the global financial system, making sure that keeps working. That's our prime mission. And I think the feedback we got from banks around the world is, given the role of the dollar in the global financial system, yeah, that will have to drive the decision that you make at the end of the day. So we took that decision in accordance with our banks and our goal of maintaining that integrity.
Is there now an institutionalized engagement at the level of central bankers and commercial banks who regularly interact with platforms like yours, monitor the integrity, monitor the sanctity of transactions and the systems?
Yeah, absolutely. There has been. We've always had close interaction with the top 10 central banks in the world. They oversee us. But in the context of the program after the Bangladesh bank attacks, a lot of that had a role for the local central banks to engage their banks on security, monitor them, make sure that they implement the controls. So we've been quite closely cooperating with the central banks around the world, through the banks or directly. So absolutely, there is a role there, yes.
Let me move to Alison. Alison, from an insurance and risk perspective, is cyberspace worth it? Can cybersecurity be achieved in reality, or do the risks simply outweigh the benefits of engaging with the sector?
So I guess the short answer to that would be yes, of course it's worth it. And I think Troll's opening remarks, I could only echo that. I think we always need to think about the fact that the digital age and the connectivity that brings us is fantastic opportunity. So we all need to do everything that we can to reduce the risk and reduce the vulnerabilities within that system so that we can all benefit. So absolutely, it's a yes. But obviously, I am a risk officer, and therefore that means I do look at a lot of the risk that's within that. If you look at the forum's regional risks of doing business report, then cyber is the #1 risk of doing business in Europe, in North America, in East Asia, in Pacific. It's second only to the environment in the global risks report in terms of long-term, highest impact, highest likelihood risks. So clearly this is not one that we should take unwisely. So it needs to be done very thoughtfully. It's definitely not too late for us to address the risk and look at the vulnerabilities, but we do need to get a move on. I think to Troll's point earlier around in 20 years, if we move the debate on from words to action, I think we really must challenge ourselves, what action are we taking in order to mitigate some of these risks? Now, the scale of this risk is so big, it does require public-private partnership, and I just want to draw a quick analogy to where this has also been incredibly successfully done to achieve a wondrous outcome. So Apollo 11, the moon landing 50 years ago, the risks of that were immense. But look at the significant benefits to society in being able to achieve that. Digital arguably has even better opportunity, but even bigger risks. But I think we should look back and remind ourselves what public-private partnerships can do together when we are motivated for a purpose and we have the same vision as to what we're trying to achieve. So I really, I take a lot of kind of hope in that, I guess. So to insurance, yes, of course, it's difficult to underwrite cyber risk. I'm not going to sit here and say it's easy. The sheer fact that model estimates of losses range from hundreds of billions to high single-digit trillions, the significant uncertainties that underpin those models to calculate what the exposure is, yes, it makes it difficult, but not impossible. So, and I think we have to go back to, we need to do everything we can to make this work. So we need to look for the opportunity and not for the difficulty. So a few things that would make this a lot easier. So common attribution protocols. So understanding actually what was the underlying vulnerability and what was the underlying cause. Understanding and monitoring actually what incidents we have, what impact they have, and what response and its effectiveness. And then really thinking about how can governments support in large-scale attacks before they happen so that we have that agreed up front. I think if we want to make insurance kind of a standard, so cyber becomes a standard insurable risk, then we really need to think about the role of insurance as not just being to something you transfer your risk to, but something where actually it's just part of a solution. Because actually the bigger solution is around reducing your risk. It's about improving your resilience to that risk. And insurance then is simply a part of that for the risk that we have been unable to reduce. So that everyone is exposed to a variety of different vulnerabilities, and we can work together to try and mitigate those as far as possible. And what is left then can be insured. But that requires a lot of exchange, and it requires very much, to Gottfried's point, it requires trust.
One of the Microsoft-supported initiatives, again, it's a multi-stakeholder global commission that's looking at cyberspace stability. I am part of that commission. And one of the commissioners, and I'm not naming him because I'm not sure whether it was under Chatham House rules, but let it be known it's not my idea. One of the commissioners in the room did mention that insurances could themselves become instruments of ensuring good behavior. Once you start pricing markets based on how the companies and governments and actors behave in those markets, you might achieve compliance. You might get states to do more to ensure their digital networks are safer, that they have certain safeguards and cyber hygiene mechanisms in place. So do you see the insurance itself becoming a driver towards pushing the world towards adopting practices that make networks safer? Price them higher. If you want to go to countries who don't practice good hygiene, assess the risk higher, much like the financial assessments on credit ratings. And do you see that coming in?
Without wanting to do an insurance risk 101 pricing guide, certainly part of the insurance value proposition is risk selection. It's about determining the better risks from the less good risks. Absolutely, that is part of what we do. But I will go back to what I said, which is particularly with relate to cyber risk, then what we need to do is improve the resilience of everyone, reduce the vulnerabilities that everyone faces, rather than just saying, okay, you just need to pay more. Because paying more is not the answer. Cyber is a risk without, it doesn't honor boundaries or borders.
Yeah.
So it's not a risk where actually it's okay for us to just charge a bit more. If you drive badly, okay, we charge you a bit more. But if you have poor cyber hygiene and you let something in which then actually can infect many others, and you could cause a system risk. I don't think our answer should just be to charge more money. I think we need to reduce vulnerabilities and we need to build resilience.
So cyber risks, therefore, are very different, pretty much like climate risks because they're
Yes.
borderless.
Exactly.
Right? Let's move to the practitioners now, and we'll come to the police chief at the very end because I think you have to make sense of all of this. But let's go to our friend from Israel. Ma'am, you've been a foreign minister, justice minister. You are now head of a political party. You are in election mode.
Oh, yeah.
People are wondering whether the election, the candidate who wins will be selected by a social media platform or by people. And of course, you've been pushing for an international framework. So sitting in your place or in your position with your experience, how do you assess what we have to do?
Okay, I think that we all can agree about the obvious, that we need to address this new challenge, that the challenge is changing, and we are far behind, talking about states, basically, without real, decision to work together, to agree on the norms that are needed, to translate it into legislation. And we all understand that if you legislate something within your own state, it doesn't give an answer because, as you said, there are no borders. It's something that the international community need to give an answer to. Before coming to election, as decision maker in Israel, while facing security threats, on one hand, you can see this as new tools to act against you. So as a state, on one hand, there's a need to join all the democratic states in the world and to give an answer to these new threats. On the other hand, other states that are not part of the democratic world, or they are part of the democratic world but are not willing to join this, they can be those that are using this in order to act against you. So on one hand, you are joining, you are taking some restriction on what you do, and on the other hand, you are open and vulnerable when it comes to those that are using it against you. So this is one dilemma. The other, which I think that we should understand that this is something that we would face in the future, is that we are talking on asymmetrical war when it comes to conventional weapons with terrorist organizations and so on. Now, it's clear now that they are behind. But in the future, they can use this also for terror attacks. So in addressing these issues, it's not only about states, not only about organizations and companies or tech companies. There's a need to cooperate in an understanding also the problems and the concerns also of some nation states amongst the democratic world. Secondly, as was said, sometimes it is being used against democracy itself. And we need also to address another challenge, which is not connected to cyber, and this is that the nature of democracies is being changed. The values are being changed, and altogether, what really worries me is that after hearing, and I'm not the one to say whether it happened or not, but when I heard about this suspicious about a Russian interference within the American election, and I said, okay, what's the average American is saying to this? I mean, it's a kind of something that I wouldn't have imagined that can happen. And the answer that really worries me was, so what? So there is less of understanding that this is something that really changes what you as a citizen want. And in Israel, we are facing elections in a few weeks from now. 4 years ago, cyber was something, or internet was something that I thought, okay, this is great. I don't need the mediator to work or to explain what I believe in to my voters. I can use the internet, and they are using it, and everything is open. I don't need the press. I don't need mediators. It was really great, a new world, and we were so happy. And now, the question is whether somebody is going to interfere within the election and change the outcome and the results. And also this was something that need to be addressed, and I'm not sure that we have the real answer to it. And this is really something that affects the nature of democracies itself. Last thing that I would like to raise as a question, because it is not only about states, it's not only about democracy, but it's also about us as human beings, as citizens of the world, about our privacy, about the way we live. And I think that there is something which is changing, because for me, I'm old enough, okay? For me, privacy is something which is very important. Mm-hmm. And the idea of somebody that gets the information about me, about what I want, about what I do, is something that it's quite difficult for me to understand and to absorb. But I think that young people, for them, it's becoming part of their life, and they are becoming indifferent to this. And therefore, I believe that we need to gather and decide what are our... Partly it's moral issue. We are talking about legislation, about norms. Norms should represent also our moral values as those believing in liberal values, in democracies. And I think that we are losing some on the way.
Mm-hmm. Brad, let me bring you into this particular conversation as well. You are someone who's spoken about influence operations interfering in democracies. Is this now a real threat, or is this still a perceptional issue? I mean, we are told that the Russians elected the American president, and it's not important whether they actually did. Just the idea that they could have has created distrust in democracy itself.
Well, I think one should separate two things. What led to a specific candidate being elected in a specific election? Yeah, that's always a bit of an imponderable, especially in a close election, because the truth is there's probably 14 different things that may have had an impact on an election. We will never know some absolute truth there. But let's then focus on what we do know. We do know, because it was documented in a report last December, that 30 million Americans have read intentional disinformation put onto social media by governments, a government, and they shared it, they liked it, they spread it, and by every reason one should conclude, they believed it.
Correct.
And this was done, I think it's fair to say, with the goal of disrupting democracy. It has not been confined to the United States. It has not been limited to disinformation campaigns alone. We, through our Threat Intelligence Center, have monitored, and we've taken legal action against these kinds of nation-state attacks against political candidates. Every single candidate running for the French presidency in 2017 was targeted and attacked, and some we were able to prevent. We have followed this activity around. It has impacted 90 nations, including Israel. It is a problem, it is a threat to democracy, and it needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed in a multiple of ways, but it starts by recognizing this is a problem and the democracies need to act together.
Catherine, I'm going to come to you now. You've heard the private sector, you've heard practitioners. You are managing an institution that is today in an interesting continent. Countries can't seem to agree with each other. You have the rise of the right, you have the rise of radicalism, you have American companies stealing your data, you have Chinese companies wanting to steal your data, and you have all sorts of easy problems to respond to. Now, as the executive director of Europol, who's working with governments who are ceding sovereignty to your institution, how easy is your role?
It's a very challenging job, and I like it very much. I took over office in May this year. And our goal at Europol is to make Europe safer. As I heard, it's for private companies the same. So our aim is to work on it. We are not a regular law enforcement agency. We do not have coercive powers. We are not the FBI of the European Union. We are, in our DNA, we have the cooperation. We are the criminal information hub. We put everything we get from member states and third countries together. We analyze and we try to find solutions for the investigators. We have also a lot of expertise, and we are known in the European Union and around the world for our expertise. Certainly in cybercrime. We have The Cybercrime Center in the European Union is in Europol, EC3. It has been founded by Mr. Truls, by the way. And in the EC3, from the start, we were aware of the fact that alone we cannot do anything. We will have to cooperate. The two main things we see in the cyber world that are very threatening to us and that are important to gain or to lose trust towards the public is identity. How do we know that we are talking about the right person on the web, in cyber world? And the second thing is the difficulties we have to link the acts and to prove the acts and to get the evidence, to get convictions before court. This is very difficult for us. And alone with the law enforcement community, we cannot do it. So that is the reason why we have to collaborate. It's in our DNA. We have advisory groups. We have people from the financial sector, because we have a lot of issue with money laundering. We want to invest more in financial crime. We have academics to be aware of the ethics about cyber and of the new technologies and the developments. We have people from the economical world, because if you have an attack in a country or a cyber attack in a country, it has a direct impact on the economy of the country. And we have, of course, the internet service providers we work together with. And then from government level, you see we have, it's a very complex and multi-dimensional environment. We have law enforcement, we have intelligence services, we have different ministries, Ministry of Interior, Justice, Economical, Foreign Affairs, and so on. So we have to try to bring this all together to have the possibility to look at what's going on in the cyber world and how can we have a holistic approach to deal with it, and how can we maintain security, and how can we gain trust from population in the use of cyber. That's the reason why we always have to look for new solutions. We need very creative people for these new solutions. And this is not always easy to find out. We believe, for instance, in crowdsourcing. We see an increase of child abuse online. We see the live streaming. We see we see that we have a real increase in the world. It's not possible for law enforcement to identify the victims, to identify the perpetrators. So we call on the public. We show the public through Twitter, to our Facebook account, our website, photographs of crime areas. And we ask them, do you recognize this object? Do you recognize this place? Of course, we do not show the faces of the children and of the perpetrators. We had the first test case a few months ago, and we had 22,000 people responding to our demands. We were able to identify 8 children and get them out of the system, because we have direct contact through the national law enforcement with the places where the abuse takes place, and we had one perpetrator convicted. So it's a strong tool to help us in the identification. Now we are working, we see that virtual currencies are a real threat.
Correct.
We have to work together now, and we are working on it with the virtual currency exchanges. They help us in the investigations, and also there we have and we see good results. So for us, the key is cooperation, but we need governments, national governments, and governments from all over the world. We need the European Union to allow us to have a good legislation for information exchange, also with the private sector, because we have in our legal framework possibilities to cooperate, but we want to go from a compliance exchange to a more intelligence-led exchange, so that also private sector can give us the information we need for our investigations. And what we also see is the frustration sometimes in private sector, because we cannot give something back. And it's always
one direction.
Yeah. And we need to work on it, and we need to create awareness about
No, in fact,
this.
that was going to be my follow-up question, that how easy has access to data become in the recent years under Europol? Or do you still rely on member state and their own treaties with international institutions through which you obtain data?
Yes. So we are working with sovereign states. National law enforcement authorities are responsible for the investigations, and they share the information with us if it is information related to our mandate, so serious and organized crime and terrorism. And then we get the information from the whole of the Union, and we put the dots, we connect the dots, and we try to create new information for them and for the whole of the Union. So we are depending on information coming from the national states, and we work with this information.
So Brad, again, let me come back to you on this. I keep coming back to you. Data is an issue. You know, there are many countries who don't sign on to many international agreements because they believe that the agreements do not serve their fundamental obligation of protecting their citizens. They don't have access to data. Getting data out of America is impossible. It takes 2, 4, 3 years. You know, some long duration. If you can't prosecute, you can't create trust. Governments lose legitimacy because they can't prosecute criminals. Now, is this one area of international cooperation that requires urgent revamp?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, and I'd actually weave together a couple of strands from what you've just been talking about. First, the child exploitation issue is always worth pausing and thinking a bit about, in part because it actually is a problem that was mostly eradicated before the internet brought it back to life. Second, it's probably qualitatively the single most horrific crime that one sees committed using the internet. Third, your description, especially the reference to live streaming, really reflects the sort of cat and mouse nature of crime and law enforcement, because originally people were trafficking in images and photos. We were able to help develop technology to identify the photos called photo DNA. It then moved to videos. Google and others, together with us as well, worked on technology to identify video. Now it's moving to live streaming, in part to evade both law enforcement's ability to use photos and video. And then that really brings us then to the need to rely on the data we do have. And the other thing about child exploitation is that it's always required close coordination by law enforcement agencies across borders, certainly across Europe, but it's really globally. And it therefore is an important case study of what we need to do to enable data to move across borders. You don't find anybody anywhere who's opposed to enabling law enforcement to work faster internationally to address this problem. We have an institution globally to facilitate the movement of data for law enforcement. These so-called MLATs, or mutual legal assistance treaties. And they worked really, really well in the 1800s. That's what they were designed for. And so there's a whole host of reforms that are needed to modernize these. And we've started to see some additional steps over the last year. In the United States, there was new legislation adopted, the Cloud Act. What it really does is it creates a domestic legal framework for new international agreements. And we need a new generation of international agreements. And I think that needs to be a priority for today. And we need to go after this priority with the recognition that it will take us into the middle of the next decade to put in place around the world all the agreements that are needed.
And this singularly will impact each of your domains in many ways, this new architecture for managing, sharing, and accessing data. We are opening it up to all of you now. I can see Ambassador Gill, who's the secretariat of the high-level panel of the UNSG. So do you want to come in at some stage? And we have some others who want to... Can we bring the mic here? And can you stand up? The camera wants to catch you. That's what I was instructed to tell you.
Thank you, Samir. A fascinating discussion. My main concern is the fragmentation of effort. So at the bottom, you have 30 plus vendors on anti-malware software. And at the top, you have all these different policy initiatives. So how do we bring it together? In a year when you have two intergovernmental processes, the GG and the open-ended working group starting within the UN, and no common end in sight. So how do we bring it all together?
I am a strong believer in pilot projects. For instance, together with the International Institute of Finance, we in Europol are trying to bring together the financial sector, the law enforcement sector. We make an assessment, for instance, of the national legislation in the different countries. And then we try to see which country is working very well in information exchange we need for law enforcement and to have more security. We try to identify the gaps, and then we try to make a good case out of it, to talk about it, to tell the stories behind, and to create awareness also in law enforcement, but also in the private sector and also with our governments, to make proposals how we could do better in the future and which systems is working, which system is not working. And for us it is important as law enforcement in the fight, for instance, against money laundering, to have information exchange. And there, when you can give effective practices and prove that there are systems that are working in national environments, we win a lot. We have in this pilot project 6 European countries, 2 countries out of Europe, and we have 14 or 15 financial banks dealing with it. And it's a growing process. First, you need a trust. Then you need results for the objectives you have, and then you have to try to work on your results, and you have to try to implement them in the system. But if you have trust, and if there is willingness for different partners, and if you have a really good conversation and an honest conversation, and you have the same goal, we want to try to solve the problem, I think then you will have a lot. We in Europol, it's in our DNA. We have to work together with sovereign states. We have to work together with the private sector because we have to be the experts. We have to be at the forefront of innovation. So we have to go beyond our normal boundaries. And we did create a lot of these initiatives, and we see that this can really help. But it's a question of trust in the beginning.
You want to come in?
Well, the only thing I was just going to add was if you look at what the forum's doing with the Centre for Cybersecurity, I think that's an excellent kind of indication of what actually can be achieved if you put together the multitude of private organisations and public who are engaged in this space. I think if you look at the goals and the initiatives that they are working on, I don't think in of itself it's bad to have competition and a lot of different suppliers. I think that's important, but I think you need to have a neutral body who can
platform
put
and a
them all
bridge.
together. Yes, and I think the Centre does that.
Well, I agree with these comments, but I'd also qualify them a bit, at least as I think about it. In the quest for global consensus, it is unfortunately too easy, I think, to gravitate towards small solutions for big problems. And I think that is a real risk. And so then the question becomes, how do we build on global steps where they're possible, but not rely on that alone?
Yeah.
And I think we've seen 2 things over the last year. One of the points of feedback that we got, that I certainly got from people in the diplomatic community, was that if the world's governments were ever going to come together with bigger solutions, the tech sector needed to start to lead the way. If tech companies could come together across borders, at least there would be more of a model. And that is an important part of the thinking that led us to launch the Tech Accord last spring. The fact that we've now got 79 companies from around the world, endorsing 4 important principles and then implementing them with concrete steps is a building block. And then I think we need to look to a coalition of the willing. If you look at the Paris call, it was clear from the first day that there were certain countries that would never sign on. And we thought, the French government, others thought about, well, what did this mean? Especially at basically the same month when there were these votes being made in the United Nations. And any month that the UN can take a new step that helps is a good month. But I actually think that one way to spur more global action is to create a bit of an alternative where more governments together with a multi-stakeholder approach, which I think can give more support for governments, can start to move faster and towards bigger solutions.
Do you want to comment on?
Yes, I want to add to this that frankly the situation is that this is a huge failure of the international community to face this challenge together, even without agreeing who should deal with this. Is it going to be nation states with companies, experts, politicians? All this discussion is being dealt without real agreement. What is the next step? What are the norms? What are the parameters? Who should be part of it? So let's put it on the table and face it. This is the situation now.
So you had an intervention.
So just a comment and a question. So Yavor Shah, Chairman of the Board of SWIFT. First, I naturally have to agree with Gottfried and Brad about the coalition of the willing does work. Because in times of uncertainty and chaos, people getting together, governments, tech center, agencies, etc., lead the way. And that seems to be working. However, that's point one. The real question to you all is, there is an increasing and accelerating gap between those institutions, banks, technology companies, and it's geographic, that are in likely the developed world that have the capability to defend, detect,
Correct.
and then recover from cyber attacks, all three. But in the emerging markets,
We are struggling.
many, it is not there. How, in addition to the coalition of the willing, do we address that increasing gap? Because we're only as good as our weakest link.
Correct. I think that's a great question. I think, and let me pose this to all of you, because Alison and you mentioned as well, you're working with banks. I think resilience is a word that's come up, capacity building implied in many of our responses. Coalition of willing is getting people to sign on to a paper, but a coalition of capacities is what we really eventually have to move towards, that we have created capacities with these partners to respond to challenges or mitigate them. So let's go down the panel and let's get your views. Let's start with Brad.
Well, the first thing, it is all about capacity building. And I think there's two elements that are among many, and others will probably have more and better thoughts than me. But the first thing I would say is, we are seeing more technological capacity being constructed in emerging markets around the world. The fact that a company like ours, just opened 2 data centers in South Africa. We've got data centers in India. We've got data centers in Brazil. We're serving countries from these regions themselves. And as that enables more institutions to move from, say, running their own server computers to relying on the cloud, that by definition is a real step up in increasing cyber defense capability. But in addition to that, one really does need to take on this question of how you institutionalize these capabilities throughout these societies. It probably has to start with both governments in these countries and the larger enterprises in the commercial space. The ultimate challenge, and it's the ultimate challenge in some ways, whether you're talking about the United States or South Africa or anywhere else, is how you help small businesses that don't have great capabilities, as well as consumers. And part of that is a technological solution. A lot of it is an educational path as well.
Yes, I'd certainly echo on the education piece. And I think actually this is probably one where insurers can play actually quite an interesting role, because we would probably have contact with many of the companies. And I would very much echo Brad's point that, this isn't just an emerging markets challenge. Actually, the number of SMEs in the United States, for instance, who wouldn't have cyber cover is scarily high. So I think this is one where if you think, okay, most companies, though, would have property cover, because that's fairly standard. So there is a pathway in to raise awareness for education, to help people understand the risks that they're exposed to, and then to talk about what vulnerabilities they face and how can we, build resilience. Again, that's more important than having to pay at the end, and then provide protection.
Catherine.
Capacity building is key also for us, and what we did, for instance, in Interpol, that we did foresee money to give the possibility to the emerging states to send people to the headquarters for training sessions. So it was free for them, and for us there was also, for Interpol, there was also a gain, because we had the potential high-ranked people to develop themselves. So, at Europol level, we invest together with the European Commission in third countries, and we foresee capacity building for them.
Yeah, I can sketch it for our microcosm, which is the banks in those emerging markets. I don't think it is a top-down approach. In fact, I think the top-down approach hopefully went out with the Soviet Union. I mean, to some extent, you have to let the market do its work and let people do what is the right thing. So you mentioned central banks before. So we have a multi-pronged approach. One is to work with these central banks in these jurisdictions. The gold standard there is of course in the West, where you've seen the Bank of England, the Fed, and the ECB. They now all have programs to really do red teaming on the banks, to look at sector resiliency, etc. Some of that is now being copied by central banks in emerging markets who have a natural role to secure the banking system, and they're starting to apply these frameworks. Another angle is the private sector. So working with the technology providers. Yesterday we had a discussion with the audit firms who need to audit all these controls, whether these banks are secure, what they can improve, etc. So I think it is a multi-pronged approach at the end of the day to do that capability with the overseers or regulators in the country, the service providers, the banks themselves. There's a role for the larger banks as well. A big part of securing these smaller banks is for the larger banks who do business with them, say, we need to do our own counterparty risk assessment here, and then the cybersecurity of their counterparty bank becomes part of the global counterparty assessment that they do from a liquidity perspective, from a know your customer perspective, and all of that. So these big banks play a role in making sure, guys, unless you shape up your cyber practices, we will either not do business with you, or only do restricted business with you. So I think it is a multi-pronged approach to really do that capability building in these local markets and lift them up. And I agree, if I had to name one problem, it is the inequality between the more sophisticated geographies
and you're only as strong as your weakest link.
And you're only as strong as your weakest.
Tzipi.
No, nothing to add to this. I mean, I can agree with everything, but I believe in top-down approach because I think that without top-down approach, we would not face the problem on only different aspects. It is clear that we have some problems with some big players in the international community, but I believe that it should be addressed because otherwise it would, it would not be addressed properly as it should.
We have time for one last intervention. Okay, we'll take two and then we'll come back to the panel, but 30 seconds each. One at the back and one in the front here, the two interventions.
Hi, Hadass Gold with CNN. We just heard that Bing is being blocked in China. So Brad, I was wondering if you could respond to that, and also if everybody could speak to how you can do these big multilateral agreements with cybersecurity when you have such huge actors that seem to have a different kind of basic point of view of what should be allowed.
And there was one intervention right here. Excellent.
Thank you so much. Vivian Lonel from the European Commission, and thanks a lot for this fascinating discussion. I was really happy to hear most of you paying much attention to attribution and how important it is in dissuading attacks. But I'd want to hear very much the reaction from the private sector, especially on what comes after attribution to member states, because what we've seen, the European Council has also called the member states to work on that, but we see the example, for example, of NotPetya attack, which was attributed by many countries to Russia, and then you've seen insurance companies saying, but it's a state-led attack and hence not covered by the policy, whereas it's far, of course, not a targeted attack. So just to see where your thinking is on that. Thank you.
So let's, again, all of you, the final word now. You're responding to them, and this is also your final intervention for the morning. Let's start with Tzipi this time. Tzipi, do you want to respond to any of these two questions? You want to say something? Your final word for the morning?
Anybody else wants to comment on Bing in China?
Well, I can.
I will answer it.
No, I'm saving Brad for the last.
I can give my answer. I was in China last week, and indeed I relied heavily on Bing because it's the search engine that worked. And last week, at least, Bing was still working in China. Let me put it that way. I use it extensively because Google indeed is blocked in China. But I was quite grateful to Microsoft for having the Bing engine.
So that's a temporal opt-out. Last week it worked. That's a good answer. I'll keep it for a different panel.
I wasn't there yesterday. So.
Catherine.
We in Europol, we are not involved in state-sponsored attacks. It's not in our mandate. But when member states in the first stage of an investigation ask our support, of course we will help them in the investigation. When we have an indication that it is state-sponsored, we have to go out because it's not in the mandate of the organization.
So maybe I'll take the attribution point then. So I think it's really important that there's clarity for the insurer and for the insured as to what exposure and what coverage is actually given. It's very different if someone's taken a property insurance cover out and is trying to claim for cyber on that policy versus if they've taken a cyber insurance policy out and are claiming on that.
Being a politician and...
I'll address both questions. First, yes. We're aware of reports and are experiencing ourselves that currently there are issues for Bing in China. We're not yet certain whether it's confined to Bing or is something that is broader. There's been a report in the Wall Street Journal about a broad set of websites that are not accessible at the moment in China. It's not the first time that we've encountered issues like this for Bing in China. These do arise periodically. We do adhere to the Global Network Initiative set of principles when it comes to search services in China. And that does mean that there are days when there are either difficult negotiations or even disagreements. But we're not aware of any ongoing negotiation or disagreement, so we're working to understand it better. I do think that the last question is a really good last question because twice since 2017, the world's governments, at least to some degree, have come together multilaterally to publish attribution decisions. First regarding WannaCry, and the second regarding NotPetya. And I think you are so right to then ask, well, what follows attribution? And clearly, I think if we want to discourage or deter acts which I think the international community would broadly regard as unlawful, then there need to be consequences. It's sort of the essence of part of why Europol exists, even though Europol, as you mentioned, doesn't address this particular area. WannaCry was interesting because that attribution announcement was made at the White House in December of 2017. Tom Bossert, the Homeland Security advisor, was pushed by journalists that morning. Well, what was the U.S. government going to do? And as he put it, well, the U.S. had so many sanctions in place against North Korea, there wasn't much left that it hadn't done. As he said, the cupboard was bare. What he did announce, what we announced together, was that Microsoft, Facebook, and another company had acted the week before to dismantle much of the malware capability of the North Korean group that had launched the WannaCry attack. It's the same group that launched the Sony attack. So that, too, shows what I think needs to be a very thoughtful and careful approach to appropriate multi-stakeholder action in certain circumstances. With respect to NotPetya or others, I don't think one should expect governments to change what they're doing if there are not consequences. I think it's absolutely right that in the wake of these disinformation campaigns, for example, governments are putting more pressure on tech companies. Whether it's informal pressure or even through new laws and regulation, that bar should be raised. But we shouldn't look to the private sector alone to respond to what are effectively military-grade cyber attacks. Mm-hmm. The private sector has never saved a country from military attacks in the past. And to expect it to do so now, and especially to do so alone, I think is a recipe for disappointment. So we need new areas of action and real thinking in this space.
We are out of time completely, and I'm not going to try and sum up this session. You've all heard it. Join me in applauding the panel for their intervention this morning, and thank you very much.